Friends, welcome. Glad to welcome you this beautiful morning to Brigham Young University for this opening panel of day 2 of our conference, Exploring Religion and the American Founding. I'm Spencer Fluhman. I'm chair of the BYU History Department and a co-organizer of the conference. I'd like to recognize Chris Stevenson, walking distinguished in the back there. He's the president and co-founder of the National Museum of American Religion, our institutional partner for this conference. We're grateful for those of you who showed up for a 9 a.m. session. Bonus points for you. We're also glad to welcome our live stream audience. We had more than 250 of you joined by live stream last night for the keynote address. So we're grateful for those who are here and grateful for those who are watching from home. This 2-day event explores the intersection of religion and the American founding as part of this semi-quincentennial year of celebration and education and memorializing. This event is made possible by the hard work of many and the institutional partnership of several important partners. In particular, this morning, we note the generous major funding for this conference provided by the National Endowment for the Humanities and from the Clements Family Foundation. Their generous support has made our work here yesterday and today possible. On the screen behind me, please take a minute to note the many additional institutions and individuals who have contributed to this conference. Yesterday, we kicked the conference off with an exciting and fantastic mentoring session for our history students, followed by 2 memorable addresses in a banquet and keynote session. And we look forward to today's sessions that run all day today until 4:30 p.m. Every hour we'll start a new one, except for that lunch break. And we're thrilled to have you all be a part of it. We hope you can see a lot of what happens today. We're going to begin today's events with a prayer, and that will be given by Ella Siegmiller, a junior at BYU from Oklahoma, majoring in exercise science.
Our Father in heaven, we thank thee for this beautiful day that we have to gather together and talk about this country that we live in. We thank thee for the men and women who have laid the foundation for the freedoms that we enjoy. We thank thee for all of the people who set aside time to come here and learn more. And we ask thee that we may have open hearts and minds to learn more from one another. We ask thee for more guidance and peace in our country and in our world today. We thank thee for the blessings that we enjoy, and we ask that we will have a safe and joyful day. And we say these things in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.
Thank you, Ella. In our first session this morning, we've invited 3 speakers to consider what we've called religious landscapes on the eve of revolution. I'm going to refer you to our conference webpage that's accessible through the QR code on our screens for their complete academic biographies. Please do check those out. You'll be impressed with their expertise and their experience, I promise. We'll first hear from Sandy Bigtree, a citizen of the Mohawk Nation and a founding board member of the Indigenous Values Initiative. After Sandy concludes, we'll hear from Dr. Catherine Carte, a professor of history at Southern Methodist University. After Dr. Carte, our last speaker will be Dr. Christopher Jones, an assistant professor of history here at Brigham Young University. We start with Sandy Bigtree, who will give us a sense of Indigenous peoples, the original religious vision on on the landscape that we now call the United States. It's appropriate that we start there. We'll note, too, that Brigham Young University sits on land that's the traditional homelands of the Shoshone and Ute peoples. So this is an appropriate start. Sandy, we'll turn it to you.
Good morning, and thank you for having me. My husband was scheduled to talk here, but he had to stay back and take care of his 92-year-old mother. So I'm filling in. He's a professor of religion at the University of Syracuse, and he was founding director of the Scano Center, which you can see in the background of the picture of the three of us. That's our little crazy rescue dog, Mickey. We live in Syracuse, New York. That is on the territory of the Onondaga Nation. And the Onondaga Nation are the firekeepers of the, what you know as Iroquois Confederacy, but we call ourselves Haudenosaunee. Iroquois was a name that was forced on us by the Jesuits. It's a colonized name. It's a degrading name. And the British referred to us as the 5 nations first and then 6 nations. That, again, is not what we call ourselves. We are the Haudenosaunee. And we have a tradition that goes back thousands of years, and it's one of peacemaking. The very category of religion came with the colonizers from Europe. We did not have a category for religion. We just lived peacefully in proper relationship with the natural world. We are not a faith-based religion. We have genuine relationships with one another and with the spirit that is embedded in every single non-human entity that we share our lives with on this planet. Not only share our lives, but they sustain ours. I hope you'll have the time to go over the banners that I was involved in organizing for the Smithsonian Institute. They had a traveling exhibit called Voices and Votes to commemorate the 250th celebration of European occupation in these lands. I'm going to give you a little background of the Haudenosaunee. I already explained about we have a lifestyle of living peacefully in harmony with this natural world, and I will go into more detail with that in a later talk. But at the time of colonization, the colonizers brought to this continent Christianity with the intention to establish Christendom all over the earth, and they were after our lands and our resources. I think that's an undeniable fact if you just give it a second thought. So we have a different relationship with Christianity. Our people greatly influenced the great thinkers of this planet. We had great orators going over into Europe in the late 17th century, talking to the new Enlightenment thinkers in Europe. And new research is being published talking about those discussions way back in the 1600s. The Wyandot, most notably, Gundyalunk was the main speaker, but they were under the wing of this great binding piece of the Haudenosaunee at that time. Following suit, the Onondaga and Haudenosaunee-Loyani clan representatives were meeting regularly with Thomas Jefferson, Benjamin Franklin, and many of the other founding fathers of this new experiment they were developing in Philadelphia. The second floor of Independence Hall, in fact, was reserved as lodging for our clan Loyani to come and share with them this knowledge of peace. As we move into, the eve of the revolution, the British and the Americans, and minded, weeks before they made the split, they were all British, okay? So they were all working together in colonizing and Christianizing our people and trying to break down our matrilineal clan system of peace. The British, I'll start with Polly here, Cooper. These were Christian Oneida, individuals who broke from our Confederacy, and they fought with Washington. Polly Cooper was commemorated in a minted coin just this January by the United States to confuse the narrative of this relationship with the Haudenosaunee. She was not Haudenosaunee, she was, from our perspective, and it's harsh, a traitor. But she is being commemorated, and this is in part a way to spread propaganda and keep this history confused, right? So she fed corn to Washington's troops during the war. And John Shenandoah, who is another Onondaga so-called Christianized war chief, fought with Washington, and he too is commemorated. In Oneida right now, the only Oneida that were allowed to stay in their territory had to be Christian and profess to be Christian, and the rest were removed to Wisconsin. I'm going to move on to Joseph Brant. Have you all learned about Joseph Brant in history? Because they even learned all about Joseph Brant in England. He had lost his father at a very young age, and it was the first British superintendent of Indian Affairs that took him under his, I hate to say, well, guidance, I guess, and Christianized him. And he was trained, Joseph Brant was trained to be a missionary so that he could Christianize the Mohawk people. And he indeed translated the Bible into Mohawk so he could facilitate penetrating their minds and changing their minds. Again, I state the Haudenosaunee do not pray. They give gratitude for the life that sustains us. It's a very different orientation to the spirit of life and this regenerative force that we're all part of, correct? So Joseph Brant had, as a child, been trained. They changed his mind. And he was not Haudenosaunee. He had broken from the Haudenosaunee. So he was trained to become the war chief. He formed an army that fought against the Americans, and I have to say 3/4 of that army were British Tories, and they were dressed up as Mohawks. And I asked the London Archives, they're working with them on their commemoration of the 250th acknowledgement. And I said, did this indeed happen? And they said, it indeed did, yeah. And we thought, what is that all about? Exactly, what is that all about? Not only that, but Joseph Brant was the first Native American Freemason, and he was given the apron officially by King George III. That's what the big deal was. It was so important that he align with the British. So moving on to the Revolution, it was his fighting with the British against the Americans at Cherry Valley that ignited George Washington's attack against all the Haudenosaunee in 1779. The Haudenosaunee had made a treaty of neutrality. They did not fight in the Revolution. They said, this is a war between brother and son. We're staying out of that. We know what family disagreements can involve. So they wisely drew up this treaty and they stayed out of it. And then Washington turns around and accuses the Haudenosaunee through Joseph Brant, who was the pawn of the British, as having gotten involved in the war. This was all like a plot. Okay, so this is what we're dealing with at the eve of the Revolution and during the Revolution. I want to say that the Haudenosaunee, prior to European contact, had influence up to Nova Scotia, out west to the Mississippi, south to the Carolinas. And they were the target. I guess that's enough for first. Thank you.
Welcome, everybody. It's great to see you all, and I want to start by thanking Spencer Fluhman and Chris Stevenson, wherever he has got to there, down here for putting together this amazing event. So my role here is to talk about the colonists within British America. So to think about, on the eve of the Revolution, as the Revolution is sort of brewing, and roughly here I'm thinking like 1763 to 1775, right? So late colonial period. Who was there? How did they think about themselves in terms of religion, and how did they understand the religious situation around them? And I'm gonna touch on three key concepts here that I think can really be helpful in understanding what the colonial religious situation looked like, and that I think have implications for how we understand both the way the war unfolded in terms of religion, but also then the development of the separation of church and state, or disestablishment, or whatever term you want to use for it, after the conclusion of the Revolution through the Constitution and First Amendment. So the first concept here is one of demographic diversity. And what I mean by that is that colonists in British North America understood that that the world was full of very diverse people, and that those people, that diversity stemmed from a variety of different sources. First, and probably most important, a full 200 years into the European colonial endeavor, British Protestants were familiar with concepts around racial diversity and what they meant in terms of Protestantism, right? So at the very beginning of, just to reiterate what Sandy just said, at the very beginning of the colonial era, European colonists did not really have a concept of who these people they encountered in North America were, North and South America, and how they would fit into a Christian worldview, because the Christian Bible does not discuss the people of North America directly. So that was kind of a theological challenge. Fast forward 200 years, Protestants had developed a variety of ways to understand who these people were, also their relationship to African-descended peoples, and how they should encounter that. There are three sort of key ways they're doing that. One is through missionary activity, and we just heard some of that, right? So British Protestants absolutely justified the extraction of resources and the enslavement of people through a missionary project. So it's okay that we're doing this because we're bringing them Christianity, which is so important, right? So missionary activity was one way to handle it. Another was a concept that a colleague of ours has called hereditary heathenism, the idea that even peoples who converted to Christianity were somehow racially other. In other words, they're a different kind of Christian because of their racial background. And then thirdly, there was a lot of belief that racial others had superstitions or witchcraft that somehow had power even if they weren't supposed to be real, right? So there was concern about whether it was demonic influence or some sort of other supernatural power. So this means that European Protestants were familiar with a kind of diverse set of worldviews, and they believed those worldviews were kind of irreducible. In other words, they weren't going to go away. They weren't going to turn everybody into uniform Protestants. A second kind of demographic diversity is the diversity between Protestants and Catholics. So the British Protestant endeavor is very much in its origins a counterattack against Catholic colonialism, against the idea that the Spanish and the French were going to make the whole world Catholic, and that was actually the wrong religion, and it had to be fought against. That was manifest very powerfully in the colonial era with wars between Protestants and Catholics, which incorporated indigenous peoples as well, and sort of convinced Protestants that Catholics were a religious threat, also a sort of irreducible threat. The Catholics didn't seem to be going away anywhere quickly. But then they were also familiar with Catholics within the fold. There were a significant number of English Catholics in Maryland, and then there were also German Catholic migrants to places like Pennsylvania. And so they, at the same time, managed prejudice against global Catholics and having Catholics around them, knowing that, this person, if I walk in their house, I'm going to see probably physical objects that represent Catholicism. So that was present as well. And then the third kind of demographic diversity is Protestant immigration, right? So there were a lot of Protestants who immigrated immigrated to the colonies who were not a part of whatever the dominant denomination in each place was. And so that meant if you were in Virginia, and most people were members of the Church of England, there were also going to be Presbyterians. There were also going to be Quakers, people who migrated legally, were loyal to the British Crown, and you weren't supposed to try to convert them because they were okay with what they were, but they were something different, right? And so British colonists on the eve of revolution had an awareness that the world was really diverse in terms of religious groups. That's the first concept. The second concept is diversity by schism. And what I mean by that is that the colonists also experienced, over the course of the colonial period, a lot of religious upheaval. And we associate most of this with the waves of revivals and awakening that start in the mid-18th century. So in every part of the colonies, Protestant denominations divided over issues of revivalism. But these divisions were not peaceful. This is actually schism. And schism is not something that Christian churches generally seek. Usually there's an idea that there's one united church, there's one right way to be. And if your congregation divides, that means somebody's on the wrong path. And either you have to eject them or you have to deal with the challenge that presents. So that diversity by schism caused major challenges to Americans. It changed laws. It pushed people to combat their neighbors, to invoke law to combat their neighbors. It caused a lot of religious disruption. Most of that happened in the sort of 1740s through 1760s. By the time we get close into the revolution, that wave has kind of subsided. And that means that in addition to being used to diversity that comes from sort of irreducible categories, people had also become used to diversity that was painful and diversity that maybe we should just let it be because it's so painful. That's a second route to accommodating one another. When we put these two concepts together, right, diversity by schism and diversity by immigration, I think it really helps us understand why, when we get to the period starting in 76 with the new state constitutions and up through the First Amendment, where states, as they're figuring out what their new religious laws are going to be, and this happens all at the state level initially, that they pretty universally go to a place of free exercise without much trouble. Virtually every state is able to say, we want to protect free exercise of religion because they don't want conflict with their neighbors over religious issues. They've seen it be painful, and they've also accepted it's not going to go away. So free exercise is a fairly easy concept for folks to come to. And this brings us to our third concept, which is a very different way that religion operated in the colonies. And this is across all of the British North American colonies. And that's the force of uniformity. So when we talk about diversity and we talk about colonial religious diversity, it's very easy just to say, well, this is the origin of religious freedom. But of course, the history of the United States is not just a history of religious freedom. It's also a history of contests over religious power. And we see the origins a lot of that in colonial law that enforced a kind of trans-imperial, across the entire empire, kind of uniformity, but a kind of uniformity through diversity. So for this, we have to go to the Glorious Revolution at the beginning of at the end of the 17th century and the sort of aftermath of the beginning of the 18th century. And in that settlement, the British Empire developed a diverse establishment that included three separate established churches. So the Church of England in England and in almost all of the colonies. The Presbyterian Church is the established Church of Scotland, and then New England had it inherited from an earlier era of colonization, a Congregationalist establishment, which the British accepted as a legitimate establishment. That means that in every part of British North America, with minor exceptions in Rhode Island and Pennsylvania, colonial governments used religious institutions in order to structure law, in order to keep track of vital statistics. Most states had some form of compulsory attendance at church, whether they enforced it or not. They had limits on dissenting on outside of the dominant church preaching. And it also means that the dominant denominations across British North America were comfortable with we'll use the word establishmentarianism, right, which is a terribly long word, but they're comfortable with the idea that there should be a church establishment. So we've got two conflicting ideas coming into the Revolution. One, we have this idea that church establishments do essential work in each colony, that church establishments organize education, they organize morality, they are funded by taxes, and that is a core part of the colonial system. And the majority of the people with civic rights in those places were parts of those churches. At the same time, they're comfortable with a lot of religious diversity. So as we move through the revolutionary period, we're going to have to see both of these ideas work out. We're going to have to see the push towards religious toleration that comes from just the experience of diversity, and also see individuals and communities grapple with how to reassign or how to trust those tasks that had been part of establishmentarian traditions, which they did not reject. Right? They did not say we should no longer have an establishment. What they generally said is we no longer want one compulsory establishment, right? They have to reassign those tasks. And arguably, we're still working through the aftermath of folks who are invested in the idea that government should very much be a part of community law. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
I will add my thanks to the organizers, to Spencer and Chris, and to my fellow panelists, Sandra and Kate. In the United States today, some 75% of Black Americans identify as Christian. And the so-called Black Church, the informal coalition of Christian churches primarily attended and led by African Americans, has played a recognizable role in Black activism throughout United States history, from the anti-slavery movement of the 19th century to the civil rights struggle of the 20th, and more recently, the Black Lives Matter movement of the 21st. With this in mind, it may come as something of a surprise to at least some of you here today that the Black church played no recognizable role in the American Revolution. Indeed, that coalition, that concept of a Black church did not yet exist. I have thus titled my remarks for today, Before the Black Church, Religious Lives of African Americans in Revolutionary America. Many African Americans in the 1770s, perhaps a majority, were not even members of a Christian church. When war broke out between Britain and her American colonies in 1775, there were approximately 500,000 people of African descent living in British North America. The vast majority of them, some 90%, 450,000, were enslaved. Gender ratios, life expectancy and mortality, and more differed from one region to another. So too did the ethnic backgrounds of the enslaved, as well as their religious beliefs and identities. African Americans in 1775 spanned the spectrum of religious identity and included members of virtually every Christian denomination of the day: Anglican, Baptist, Congregationalist, Methodist, Moravian, Presbyterian, Quaker, Catholic, and so on. And there were also Black Muslims, Black Jews, and of course those who adhered to and practiced a variety of West and West Central African beliefs and rituals. The American Revolution would ultimately prove transformative to Black religious life in America and indeed beyond. It led in ways both directly and indirectly to the formation of the first independent Black Christian churches in the United States, marking the beginning of this Black church tradition I referenced before. It also strengthened the nascent anti-slavery movement in both the United States and the British Atlantic world. And like so many other participants in the American Revolution, people of African descent drew on their faith to build community, resist slavery, and ultimately pursue freedom. The beginnings of Black Christianity, though, predate the arrival of even the first Europeans to reach the Americas. Portuguese missionaries had, by the mid-15th century, that's the 1400s, introduced Catholicism to West and West Central Africa. In 1491, a year before Christopher Columbus arrived in the Caribbean, several prominent rulers in the Kingdom of Congo converted to Catholicism, and by the turn of the 16th century, the new King of Congo, Christian Alfonso I, had made Catholicism the established or state-supported church of his kingdom. Due in part to this alliance between Portugal and Congo, at least some of the captives sold into slavery and transported across the Atlantic Ocean arrived in America as baptized Christians. The majority of the 12.5 million enslaved who endured the Middle Passage between 1500 and 1850, of course, did not. And while Portuguese, Spanish, French, and Dutch colonizers sought to convert enslaved Africans in their American colonies to Christianity, the English proved more hesitant, or at least more conflicted. Individual missionaries did exist, as Kate mentioned, but their efforts were sometimes stymied by fears that conversion to Christianity would provide enslaved Africans with a legal route to freedom. Most enslaved Africans themselves likewise proved resistant or uninterested in the missionaries' message. That finally began to change in the late 17th century, when using baptism as a legal route to sue for one's freedom was legally overturned, and the early to mid-18th century, when renewed missionary efforts by the Church of England's Society for the Propagation of the Gospel in Foreign Parts, I don't know who was naming these things, but come on, okay? Together with proselytizing by upstart groups like the Moravians, New Light Congregationalists, Presbyterians, Methodists, and Baptists, began to finally make sustained inroads among Africans in British North America, including both enslaved and free. The revivals of the so-called Great Awakening both targeted and attracted individuals across the colony's racial, religious, and class divisions. And African Americans, both enslaved and free, began to show up regularly in the baptismal, marriage, and burial records of Congregational churches in New England, of Presbyterian churches in the Middle Atlantic, and in Anglican, Methodist, and Baptist churches of Virginia, the Carolinas, and Georgia. The religious experience of these proselytes was shaped by their location and their status as free or enslaved. In Massachusetts, for instance, where enslaved individuals made up a comparatively small percentage of the broader population, African Americans attended church alongside their white counterparts. While they sometimes were forced to sit in pews, physically segregated by race, at other times they worshiped alongside them. And for a few hours each week, enslaved Africans counted themselves as the spiritual equals of their enslavers and overseers. Further south, enslaved Christians, especially those living on large plantations, had their own services, with a white preacher preaching to them in a grove of trees or a hastily built chapel on an enslaver's property. Perhaps even more importantly, though, enslaved African Americans made time to meet far from the strict oversight of white preachers and white owners who chose to emphasize obedience as the fundamental law of Christian life. When Methodist preachers from England first arrived in Virginia's Tidewater region in the early 1770s, they found a receptive audience among many enslaved people there. In addition to their attendance at the preaching services of white preachers, they also met in clandestine class meetings, often late at night in secluded confines of the Great Dismal Swamp, far from the watchful eyes of owners and overseers. One early convert named Mary, a domestic slave in the home of a prominent Norfolk planter and county official, later described for so many nights in the week after having put her master and mistress to bed, taking her own child upon her back and going up into the country, and during the night assembling a number of other slaves and instructing them in religious matters. Others, including a young, charismatic convert named Moses, owned by a Suffolk merchant named Mills Wilkinson, likewise assumed a leadership role, functioning as a lay preacher to his fellow enslaved. These meetings constituted the beginnings of what historian Albert Raboteau famously labeled the invisible institution. These gatherings also proved formative to the development of the Black Christian network that would ultimately shape the slaves' decisions when war reached their backyard. On November 7th, 1775, Lord John Murray, the 4th Earl of Dunmore and Royal Governor of Virginia, issued a proclamation declaring martial law in the colony and announcing that all indentured servants, Negroes, and others appertaining to rebels that are able and willing to bear arms, who joined His Majesty's troops as soon as may be, would be awarded freedom in return. Among the several thousand Virginians among the several thousand Black Virginians who successfully escaped to British lines in the months that followed was a tightly knit community of several hundred Black Methodists, whose numbers included Mary Perth and Moses Wilkinson. Linked by ties of both biological and spiritual kinship, the group had converted under the preaching of the first Wesleyan itinerants to reach the region. After a brief stint in Dunmore's Ethiopian regiment, battling both rebel forces and a deadly outbreak of smallpox, the surviving Black Loyalists spent the majority of the war in British-occupied New York City. Charles Inglis, the rector of New York City's Trinity Church during the war, noted that attention to the Negroes has become the more necessary as some thousands of them have escaped to New York from the revolted colonies. Methodists likewise joined Anglicans in attending to the needs of these liberated Black African men and women. The Methodist John Street Chapel was located close to both the barracks that housed Black soldiers during the war and Canvastown, home to thousands of additional refugee slaves. With irregular leadership from white preachers, all licensed Methodist preachers from England had opted to return home at the beginning of the conflict. Black Methodists did what they had done in Virginia before, organizing themselves into classes and congregations and worshiping with or without white oversight. The Virginia Methodists in New York were joined there by other self-liberated African Americans from throughout the 13 colonies, as well as white Methodist loyalists and at least some still enslaved African Americans. John Street's worshipers notably included a Black man named Peter Williams, who had been converted under the preaching of white Methodist lay preachers Philip Embury and Thomas Webb in the 1760s. At some point prior to the outbreak of war, Williams was sold to a man named James Amar, who worked as a tobacconist and trained Williams in the trade. Peter Williams met his wife, Molly Durham, at Methodist worship in New York City, and in 1780, the couple welcomed to the world their son, Peter Jr. When James Amar, a staunch loyalist, left for Canada in 1783, he sold Peter Williams to the trustees of the Methodist meeting in the city of New York. Negro Peter, as he was known in early records, was appointed sexton and undertaker of the chapel, a position for which he received a small remuneration, which he put towards periodic payments for the churches or to the church's trustees to eventually secure his own freedom. After the American Revolution, Peter Williams joined other Black Methodists in New York City in petitioning Methodist Bishop Francis Asbury for permission to organize a separate Methodist congregation for Blacks. Similar efforts in Delaware, Philadelphia, and Baltimore eventually resulted in the formation of the first independent Black Methodist churches, namely the African Methodist Episcopal Church and the very similarly named African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church. Independent Black Episcopal and Black Baptist churches soon followed, laying the institutional groundwork for the Black church that would prove so consequential in future decades and centuries of the American story. But Black Baptists and Methodists also introduced their independent classes and congregations further abroad as well. Several thousand of the Black loyalists living in New York City during the war left following the conflict and settled in the British province of Nova Scotia, where they were promised both freedom and land as compensation for their service during the war. There they faced discrimination and many were denied their promised land grants. They again found solace in church, in Christian worship, transporting their classes and congregations across imperial lines and continuing to worship separately from their white Methodist counterparts. In the 1790s, as Black Methodists in Philadelphia and New York were beginning to hold the first independent Black Methodist worship services, most of the Black Methodists in Nova Scotia left the colony and sailed across the Atlantic Ocean to Sierra Leone, an upstart effort by abolitionist-minded Englishmen. Once more, Black Methodists, as well as Black Baptists and Calvinist Methodists, known as Huntingtonians, transported with them their religious beliefs, practices, and organizational structures. The Black church was thus an international effort, spurred by migration and movement, and forged during the American Revolution and its aftermath. But what of those individuals who remained enslaved over the course of the conflict? Those who were unsuccessful or who did not even dare attempt to flee and remained in Virginia or Maryland or South Carolina. Like their counterparts who did escape slavery, they took advantage of the war's disruption to declare their own independence in a variety of ways. In Fayetteville, North Carolina, a free Black shoemaker named Henry Evans began to preach to enslaved African Americans with great effect. When local authorities interfered and prohibited from preaching, he withdrew to the sandhills out of town and held meetings in the woods, changing his appointments from place to place, thus skirting the letter of the law and eluding the town council. In Oxon Hill, Maryland, just across the Potomac River from Alexandria, Virginia, another group of free and enslaved African Americans built a small chapel and began holding weekly meetings. Their society is very numerous and very orderly, wrote one surprised white preacher upon encountering them. Even as this invisible institution persisted in the enslaved South, the boundary separating it from the nascent Black church, emerging at the same time in the North, grew increasingly blurry. By the early 19th century, the African Methodist Episcopal Church had begun making inroads as far south as South Carolina. What seemed to unite Black Christians throughout wartime North America was a sense of themselves as participants in a sacred and divine history. Historian James Bird has observed that no biblical narrative was more influential or more diverse in its applications during the Revolutionary War than the story of Exodus and its intrepid, if inarticulate hero, Moses. But whereas white patriot ministers and politicians saw in the account a parallel between the case of Israel and that of America, and between the conduct of Pharaoh and that of King George, the formerly enslaved women and men fleeing their masters and meeting without their consent reversed that reading, pointing out the hypocrisy of equating taxes and lack of representation with slavery while continuing to hold others in bondage and to profit from their unpaid labor. In later reminiscences, Black Methodists in both Philadelphia and Freetown framed their wartime experiences as their own search for a promised land. Imagining themselves as modern children of Israel, they compared their escape from slavery to that of their biblical predecessors, fleeing the oppression that King Pharaoh wherewith oppressed the Egyptians. African Americans drew upon their faith to not only survive the Revolutionary War, but also to find and make meaning of it. Thank you.
All right, we've provided about 10 minutes here for questions that you might have for our panelists. Because of the way we're arranged here, I'll need you to raise your hand, maybe even wave it so that I can see you. I'll call on you. We'll have you speak, project your voice as much as you can. Then it'll be necessary for the panelists to restate your question. So if you could make sure your question's nice and loud, that you direct it to whomever you'd like to answer, and then we'll restate it before responding. So questions now, please. Yes, please, right here. Comments on the recent Ken Burns documentary from any of the panelists?
Well, he certainly has accumulated a lot of history, but he's learning all the history from written texts, right? So watching this film, he didn't really, he mentioned the contributions of the Haudenosaunee and then went on to deliver that confusing sense that, oh, well, Joseph Brant fought for the British and the same old narrative. And then we had other, factions fighting with George Washington. But these were individual people who had been groomed to separate from the Confederacy, being Christianized, and he didn't cover any of that. So for me, it grossly, missed the point. The Haudenosaunee I had mentioned are the fire keepers. I also have to add, they are the only Native nation in the United States that is governed by their pre-colonial clan system. Every other territory has a tribal government that was imposed on them by the United States federal government. It's more or less a puppet regime. And Joseph Brant really served as the model for that relationship because all those leaders that are recognized had gone through the boarding school experience and they were Christianized. And throughout my lifetime, those tribal leaders were at odds with the traditional representatives of our people. There are traditional people all over the place, but the Onondaga are still recognized with their pre-colonial sense. Just one more quick thing. Vine Deloria had dinner with us several years ago before he passed, and he said, the only true line back to understanding treaty obligations with Native people is through the Onondaga Nation, because they are, in fact, the firekeepers for all Native voices in this country, because they held on to that relationship. Okay.
Thank you, Sandy. Other comments back from the panel?
That's a great question. I think Ken Burns is a brilliant documentarian, and he worked very hard to incorporate the voices of a wide range of historical scholars. The challenge, I think, that you can bring to that documentary is, I think, one that follows from where our scholarship is right now, which is that we've really embraced the idea that once the war started, events follow rapidly on events, which I think is what you see in war and is where the scholarship is right now. So it becomes a narrative that drives itself. One event leads to the next event. And it becomes possible in that, or it happens in that overarching narratives fall away a little bit. So why individuals were fighting, why groups were fighting, stronger forces or trans-historical forces that might be brought to bear on the story tend to move a little bit into the background. I think our challenge as scholars is to balance those two. On the one hand, wars, when you start a war, you don't know where it's going to go, right? That is just true. On the other hand, some of the trends and issues that we see leading into the revolutionary conflict, including forces of colonization that were consistent between the British and the Americans, right? Some of those forces that are going in carry through and are manifest after. And I think Burns's documentary kind of loses track of some of those narratives a bit.
I will just quickly add, I think that Burns's work can serve as a wonderful entry point to trying to understand the American Revolution. My hope is that it prompts individuals to dig a little bit deeper into any of the various issues that have been mentioned here, instead of that being an endpoint to their investigation to understand the war. Thank you.
In the back here, please. Question is a favorite thing from these deeper dives these scholars have taken that has kind of proven influential in their lives. Did I get that right? Good. Panelists, anyone?
Well, in my life, oh, I'm sorry, go ahead. Okay, all right. With our work, it has kind of uncovered the problem and it's a very uncomfortable problem. But we all need to be talking about this conflict of history.
I think we probably all have our favorite little stories, right? But I think the thing that I keep taking away from this, and here I'm going to say the opposite about what I have the same problem that I think Ken Burns has, that when I dig into individual lives, just how unpredictable and disruptive the revolution was, and how often somebody who went into that era with a strong sense of the choices that they ought to make, that either those choices they were no longer available to them, or personal tragedy overtook, or just the forces of war bring chaos. And I think the longer I spend looking at the revolution, the more uncomfortable I am with clean stories that, what I get from my students often, I teach religion and politics, I teach religion in the American Revolution. What I get from them is, the colonists fought for religious freedom, and look, we have it in the First Amendment, and wow, that's not the story, right? There's just so much more to that.
Amen.
Well played. We've got a time for maybe one more question. Please, right here, Dr. Roberts.
Thank you all so much. As you think about the books that you're writing and the talks that you give, do we need one book on religion in the American Revolution? Or would that simplify things too much? If you think about what our field needs, and Kate, you kind of come closest with the kind of comprehensive view that we have, but there are going to be all sorts of stories that get left out. Can we do a synthetic history that is just religion, the revolution, or should it be a series of different religious traditions in their experience of the revolution?
We are all professionally obligated to say all our voices are really important. On behalf of Spencer and Chris and myself, no, we need lots of books.
So your question is also confusing because, like I said, we have no concept of religion before European contact. So we need to also go a little deeper of what our and your ancestors, going back farther, were about and what they were, living.
You rightly pointed out that Kate's book, Religion in the American Revolution, probably comes closest to providing that sort of comprehensive narrative. I will also put in a plug here for a forthcoming edited volume that she has forthcoming from University of Virginia Press. Is that right? I'm glad I got that right. Called The Revolutionary Turns, which is a compilation of essays on various aspects of religion during the American Revolution that I think highlights the complexity of this alongside her very fine monograph.
And I'll add one more thing, too. The histories that were written were from a definite perspective of conquest, because you all learned about Joseph Brant being Iroquois or Haudenosaunee. And so it's very manipulated. You can't trust the texts.
So we've ended with a call for more complexity, more diversity, narratives that are more careful, that take in multiple perspectives. So for the historians in the room, get to work. There's much to do. Will you thank this panel with me for their work this morning? We'll take about a 5-minute break for our next panel to assemble. You're welcome to do whatever you need to do. We hope you come back, many of you, for our next panel starting on the hour.
Okay. Welcome, everybody, to session 2 of our amazing program today. I am Spencer Wells. I work with Chris Stevenson in an advisory capacity at the museum, and it's just wonderful to see your bright, smiling faces here. We have a jam-packed panel for you today, so we're going to go ahead and get started. I'm going to introduce everyone briefly, and we will go from there. So, we're really privileged to have 4 wonderful archivists and scholars with us today. We have Teresa Fry-Alexander, who is the Curator of Education and Interpretation at the Shaker Heritage Society. We have Kyle Roberts, who is the Executive Director of the Congregational Library and Archives in Boston. Nancy Taylor, the Executive Director of the Presbyterian Historical Society in Philadelphia. And Michelle Gans, the Archive Director for the Dominican Sisters of Peace. And we'll go in that order, and we'll let you guys present as you see fit. Thank you so much for being here. Let's give them a round of applause.
Hello. I just want to start by saying, pardon me, that it is a big year for Shaker Heritage Society. It's the 250th anniversary, not just of America's founding, but also of the arrival of the Shakers to our site. So, every twist and turn of the Shakers' founding narrative or origin story is impacted by the American Revolution. The Shakers even maintained that the Revolution was the providential work of God, that America needed to become the land of liberty for the sake of the Shaker gospel. Ann Lee, the leader of the Shakers, was no doubt a revolutionary in her own right. The revolution she waged was predicated on a set of ideals, just like the American Revolution, but hers was a spiritual one. While the Patriot cause sought to establish a new republic free from political tyranny, she sought to establish a spiritual kingdom within its context where the rights of conscience afforded by the newly established government could be fully realized and individual religious liberty could reign. But it's complicated, a theme developing. Ann Lee and her followers arrived in New York City in 1774, on the eve of revolution, from Manchester, England. Like so many others, they came to the New World out of a desire for religious freedom. In England at the time, there was only one state-sanctioned religion, the Church of England, whose head was the king. Essentially, church and state were one and the same. Now, the Shakers believed something radically different. Like the Quakers, they believed that there was no need for an intermediary at all, or a church hierarchy. Instead, each individual could experience the divine directly. But the Shakers combined this belief with a very active form of physical worship that involved spinning, jumping, and of course, shaking. So they were derisively called the Shaking Quakers. This is how the United Society of Believers in Christ's Second Appearing came to be known as simply the Shakers. What's more, though, they believed that Christ's second appearing had already occurred through Ann Lee and all of the Shakers, that they embodied the Christ spirit. The controversy around their beliefs was of course amplified by the fact that they were led by a woman. Today, plenty of people would have a hard time accepting that. So you can imagine that in the mid-1700s, when women were considered property and had no rights, this caused a stir. And in fact, it landed Ann Lee in jail. But she was resilient. While in jail, Ann Lee had a vision of building a religious community in the New World, and she set out to make that vision a reality. Back to New York City. When the Shakers arrived in 1774, revolutionary fervor was heating up. The Sons of Liberty had just executed their lesser-known Manhattan Tea Party, also a protest against British taxation. And by 1776, New York City was under siege by the British. Once again, the Shakers found themselves fleeing the arm of British law. Amidst a wave of 20,000 terrified people escaping brutality and violence, the Shakers headed up the North River, today called the Hudson, through the woods until they arrived at the site where I work, in a place then called Niskayuna, a Mohawk word for extensive cornflocks. Mohawk people lived there and used the alluvial river flats to grow corn. That summer, also, since there's someone here from Mohawk Nation who would know what I'm talking about, we were directly at the eastern entrance of the Longhouse, is right where the Shakers went to. That summer, the Declaration of Independence was signed, and the moment marked a new independence for the Shakers too. As the war raged around them, they began to build their first community in the woods. It was centered on the Shaker principles of confession of sin, celibacy, equality, and pacifism. But no one could escape the effects of war, even in the woods. William Lee, Anne's brother, worked as a blacksmith in Albany. The artisan he worked for made nails and handcuffs for the Continental Army. The part of town where he worked was in fact a hotbed of revolutionary activity. Alexander Hamilton, the Schuyler sisters, Aaron Burr, all lived and worked in the very same neighborhood at the time that William worked there. George Washington even paid a visit. As the years went on and the revolution continued to smolder, people naturally grew weary because life in a war zone is hard. In order to muster continued support, the patriot cause became more intentional and more zealous. This meant using force. New York State created the commissioners, back to the names, created the commissioners for detecting and defeating conspiracies. These commissioners were charged with snuffing out any perceived threat. They began a mass incarceration campaign, which is to say that they arrested anyone they viewed as a threat. About 10% of the Hudson Valley's white male population was arrested for disaffection or lack of enthusiasm for the war, the revolution. As pacifists, the Shakers certainly fit into the threat category. In 1780, the commissioners caught wind that the Shakers were successfully preaching pacifism. Anne Lee's message was this: it is impossible for a person to live in wars and fighting and to be a person of God. She told anyone who would listen that these two things were mutually exclusive. On July 24th, Mother Anne, her brother William, and 5 other Shakers were arrested. The charges were that by their conduct and conversation, the Shakers disturb the public peace and are daily dissuading the friends of the American cause from taking up arms in defense of their liberties. She was first held at the Albany courthouse and prison. Which is the picture on the left. But she attracted crowds. So they transferred her 70 miles south down the Hudson to the commissioner's jail in Poughkeepsie. This slide also shows the minutes from the hearing of the commissioners for detecting and defeating conspiracy, actually her releasement trial. The commissioners use her married name, Standerin, although history remembers her by her maiden name. So starting about 1/4 of the way down, resolved upon the application of William Lee's, that Anne Standerin, who was some time ago sent to Poughkeepsie on account of her influence in bringing persons to the persuasion professed by the people called Shaking Quakers. The said persuasion having a tendency to alienate the minds of people from their allegiance to the state by inculcating an opinion of the unlawfulness of taking up arms in defense of the American cause. And it appearing that many of the persons of the said persuasion have been reformed, and that no further evil is to be apprehended from her influence or example, therefore resolved that said Anne Standerin have permission to return to Niskayuna on the said William Lee's and James Whitaker, entering into a bond conditioned for the said Anne Standerin's appearing before any 3 of the commissioners for conspiracies when thereunto required for her good behavior, and not saying or consenting to any matters or things inconsistent with the peace and safety of the United States. And then you can see that her bond was paid by her brother William and James Whitaker, who would be her successor. And maybe people who are more knowledged than I am in the Revolutionary era more broadly, 100 pounds was a lot of money. I think it was like close to $15,000 or $20,000. So the commissioners claim that her message of pacifism was evil. That must have been a really tough pill to swallow. Notice that she's not accused of disaffection, as most people were. Instead, they pinpoint her influence and example. As a religious leader, she had tremendous sway. And lastly, she's essentially released on good behavior. I suspect that she was not present for this hearing because I can't imagine that she would have paid lip service to the commissioners. And she most certainly did not begin to subscribe to their version of good behavior after her release. So do not confuse pacifism with complacency. She didn't stop. Instead, she took her show on the road. She traveled around New England and successfully spread her gospel. She continued to face violent persecution, but just as in England, Anne Lee and her followers were ready to face the consequences of standing by their beliefs. No one really knew what to make of the Shakers. Some New Englanders thought they were part of an English plot to neutralize the populace with religious fervor and pave the way for British reconquest of England. The Shakers were beaten, kidnapped, and driven out of town after town, but gaining converts at every step of the way. So, like I said, it's complicated. In spite of all of their seemingly terrible experiences, the Shakers did believe that the revolution was the providential work of God and that they owed their existence to the Patriot victory, that America was destined to become the land of liberty for the sake of the Shaker gospel. During the missionary journey through New England, a man named Issachar Bates, who was a fifer during the Revolution, saw Anne Lee preaching in Massachusetts, and he was convinced by what she had to say. He had a wife and kids, and it took him some time to commit to joining the celibate Shakers, but he eventually did in 1801. And the necessity of patriot victory for religious freedom, or what some might call the rights of conscience, to have the right to follow one's own conscience, was not lost on him. This is the sheet music for a hymn written by Issachar Bates after the war. It's called The Rights of Conscience, and this is actually just the first two verses of 17. It's a long song, and I will sing the first verse for you. Rights of conscience in these days now demand our solemn praise. Here we see what God has done by his servant Washington, who with wisdom was endowed by an angel through the cloud, and led forth in wisdom's plan to secure the rights of man. The line, here we see what God has done by his servant Washington, and rights of freedom will maintain and our independence gain. This hymn is extolling Washington and is used as a rallying cry for taking full advantage of the rights of conscience. The hymn also goes on to point out the need to continue the trend and become liberated from economic slavery and to eradicate chattel slavery in this land. Yet Issachar manages to put a tidy bow on all of this complication. Later on in verse 8, Issachar simplifies the undeniably complicated nature of the Shakers' experience of the revolution. He writes, "Each one seeks his neighbor's good, no more shed each other's blood. Let the eyes of priests and kings view the eagle's spreading wings. These are to a woman given. Guard the place where she is driven. He's painting an image of an eagle, presumably a bald eagle, flying above Anne Lee, guarding her and the other Shakers, while kings and priests look on, unable to stop her in the land of liberty. Thank you.
Well, that was a hard act to follow. Thank you, Teresa. And thanks to the conference organizers and our hosts for bringing us all together today. And maybe they've changed the order from the program, and it was supposed to be you next, Michelle, since you were up there.
Do you want me to?
I'm sorry.
I think they're going to change.
Are they going to change it? Okay. All right. I just really wanted to get up and talk to you all. So. So when asked by the conference organizers to talk about how New England Congregationalists participated in the American Revolution and the founding of the new nation, I knew I really wanted to talk about Abigail Cleveland. So how did Abigail Cleveland participate in the American Revolution? Well, and we didn't piggyback this, we didn't mean it this way, but she sang about one of its bloodiest battles. As a teenager in Connecticut in the 1770s, Abigail Cleveland likely participated in the American Revolution in many ways. It would have been hard to avoid it, but one overlooked mode of participation that she documented is by singing. So who is Abigail Cleveland? She is likely the daughter of Thankful Payne and Aaron Cleveland, born on the 5th of August in 1759 in Canterbury, Connecticut. After the war, she married the son of a Congregational minister from Byfield, Massachusetts, and moved up there. Many members of her family, including her brother, her father, and future husband, fought in the American Revolution. In the collection of the Congregational Library is her handwritten music book. It includes over 70 different songs and tunes carefully written out by hand. Most are sacred, but there are some patriotic secular songs as well. Now, Cleveland likely learned these songs in a local singing school. She might have carried this music book with her to each meeting, filling its pages as she expanded her own repertoire. The singing school movement really began in Boston in the 1720s, but exploded in the time of the Great Awakening. The revivalist emphasis on the emotive power of singing to facilitate spiritual rebirth led them to moving away from psalm singing into writing hymns. There was much sacred music that had been published by English composers between 1700 and 1750, but the first great work by an American sacred music composer is William Billings' The New England Psalm Singer from 1770, written specifically for an American audience. At one stroke, this tanner, political ally of Samuel Adams and singing master, had created a new musical standard for the New England singing school, written in a style that was undeniably and very identifiably American, explains scholar Steve Marini. Under Billings' leadership, the singing school movement spread throughout southern and central New England in the 1770s and 1780s. And there are many Billings songs in this manuscript book. Maryland, Majesty, Connection, Washington, Kittery, Aurora, Jordan, and Chester. And for any of you who remember the John Adams documentary with Paul Giamatti from years ago, Chester is the song that they're singing in Old South Church before they go off to throw the tea in the harbor. But the one that stands out to me is the one on the screen, Bunker Hill, a Sapphic Ode. Well, the Battle of Bunker Hill, as a reminder, took place on the 17th of June, 1775, one of the bloodiest conflicts of the American Revolution. In early June of that year, British commander Thomas Gage had signaled his intention to occupy Dorchester Heights and Charlestown. And those of you who know Boston, these are the kind of heights overlooking the city. But once the New England militia caught word of Gage's intention, they decided to secure Bunker Hill for themselves. On that evening of June 16th, American forces, numbering nearly 2,000, marched from Cambridge to Charlestown under cover of darkness. When they got there, they began to build a redoubt. Unfortunately, morning broke before they finished. British warships in the harbor saw them and started bombing with full force. Pretty soon, 1,500 redcoats are being ferried over on barges. By the evening of June 17th, by the end of that day, the British had secured Charlestown at a cost of 226 British lives and 140 American lives. At the time of the Battle of Bunker Hill, Abigail Cleveland is 15 years old. Her brother is at Yale. Soon after, he is going to be commissioned in the 2nd Connecticut Regiment of the Continental Army. Later on, he's going to join a newly formed Corps of Engineers and is mostly remembered today for being the namesake of Cleveland, Ohio. So how do you write a song about this bloody, disastrous battle? Sacred music scholar Nim Cook has traced the song's lyrics back to a broadside that was published in Norwich, Connecticut in October 1775. So just 3 months after this battle, they're already commemorating and memorializing it. It was written by another Congregationalist, Nathaniel Niles, from nearby Rhode Island. Those are the lyrics. We're not really sure when the music gets attached. The earliest published music with it is from Andrew Law's 1781, A Select Number of Plain Tunes. But I do wonder how many manuscript books, like Abigail Cleveland's, had a song already attached to it. So how would you sing a song about a traumatic event in your community? I'm not going to sing for you all because you wouldn't want to hear that. I'm not gifted that way. The song starts pretty bleakly, and it asks a pointed question. Why should vain mortals tremble at the sight of death and destruction in the field of battle, where blood and carnage, clothe the ground in crimson, sounding with death groans? We're starting on a high point here, guys. So the answer, though, that's then given in the second stanza reflects a reality that 18th century Congregationalists knew all too well. Death is always imminent. For those providentially oriented people, God had a hand in it, so they knew they had to be prepared. Abigail sings, "Death will invade us by the means appointed, and we must all bow to the King of Terrors. Nor am I anxious if I am prepared what shape he, i.e. death, comes in." By the fourth stanza, Abigail asks, what if death could be for a higher calling? And the song concludes on a slightly more optimistic note. Life for my country and the cause of freedom is but a trifle for a worm to part with. And if preserved, in so great a context, life is redoubled. So redoubled, an old-fashioned word there for being sort of even greater. This song in Abigail Cleveland's music book reminds us of the barbarity of war, the precarity of life, the providential work of God, and the hope that you might just contribute to something far greater than yourself. And I love the idea of all of these teenagers in rural Connecticut kind of singing this song that meshes the religious and the political together. So how and why did Abigail Cleveland's fellow Congregationalists participate in the American Revolution? Well, it's well known that Protestant dissenters came to North America in two waves in the early 17th century. The Pilgrims, who first arrived at Plymouth, Massachusetts in 1620, were a small group of separatists who had fled England to establish a pure church in the New World, free from Anglican control. In the 1630s and 40s, thousands of Puritans left England and settled in Massachusetts Bay. They carried with them the goal of reforming the English church rather than separating from it. New England for them was to be a city on a hill, an ideal Christian society that might serve as an example to Old England and to the rest of the world. In time, Pilgrims and Puritans became Congregationalists, and their meeting houses stood as community centers in towns across New England. There was not much of what scholars have come to call a sort of spiritual marketplace in pre-revolutionary New England. In Massachusetts in 1725, 85% of the churches were congregational, with a small handful of Anglicans, Quakers, and Baptists. By 1795, and that's 85% of all the churches. By 1790, that number had decreased to 65%, but that's only because a large Baptist movement, many of whom had left congregational churches during the Great Awakening and its aftermath, had broken away. Still, though, Congregationalists were dominant, and as Kate signaled, tax-supported. They were the established faith of Massachusetts. The Congregational Meeting House was not only a place of worship, it was a site of town meeting, an arsenal where powder and ball could be stored, a rallying point for troops marching off to war, an intelligence center, often from the pulpit itself, for news of the war as it was brought from the battlefield. And I think it's important to remember that within congregational churches, members held equal power, all of them responsible to each other under the covenant that formed the basis of their community life together. In fact, a minister had to be a member of that church before he could be chosen and ordained as the minister. Even his power was subject to the will of the congregation. Congregational New England was somewhat unique in the Atlantic world. Ordinary citizens had unprecedented power to make decisions about land and property and to hold their leaders in check. They were people who fiercely embraced self-government, and not surprisingly, they played an active role in the revolution. Now, scholars have often focused on the rhetoric and exploits of patriot congregational ministers rather than the rank-and-file women and men, enslaved and free, the Abigail Clevelands of the world, who gathered at the meeting house every week and sat in the pews. And I think this is a great difference between 2026 and 1976, where at least within congregational history, there was so much focus on patriot preachers. Now we're much more interested in those folks sitting in the pews. And if we ignore them, if we don't look to the pews, we miss people like Mary Counts, a Boston housewife who wrote a poem in response to the horror of the Boston Massacre. In this two-stanza poem, which we just found a few years ago, had never been published, Counts expresses her horror at what had happened to her community and blames the British soldiers squarely for the murder of her fellow Bostonians. She then heartbreakingly expresses her fears for the future and how the situation has personally affected her, even cries out to God for intercessions in strains familiar to her from Puritan poetry. We also miss Joshua Fletcher, who was a farmer in Lancaster, Massachusetts, who openly challenged his minister as the war dragged on. This is a long war, and we'll hear a lot about this today. This was not an easy victory for the Americans, and it was easy. One could imagine that by the time you reach year 3, year 4, you start to lose hope. You might start to think that this sacred rebellion that you have fought might actually not be providentially ordained. Fletcher and 2 other members of the church in Lancaster wrote a letter of complaint against Reverend Timothy Harrington for being a suspected loyalist for not supporting the war cause. They complained that his conduct is grossly contrary to God's word, and that they accused him of speaking evil of all of our civil rulers, Congress, continental, and provincial. Even more troubling, he was accused of preaching and discouraging against the raising of men to go out in defense of the country. And if we don't look to the pews, we miss Violet, an enslaved woman caught in the crosshairs of her enslaver minister and her deacon. At a parish meeting in December 1780, Benjamin Coleman, the church deacon in Byfield, Massachusetts, raised a public complaint against the long-serving Reverend Moses Parsons. Coleman accused his minister of the wicked practice of man stealing and of recently trying to sell Violet for a very large sum of money. Now, Violet had been enslaved by the minister and had been a full member of the church for 20 years. Reverend Parsons brought Coleman in front of the church for a trial. The church sided with the minister. They voted to suspend Coleman from church because they felt that he had behaved in an unjust and unchristian manner by calling out Parsons for enslaving Violet. We know about this because Coleman then turned to the newspaper and published a very virulent anti-slavery message. These questions of liberty and liberty for whom, after the war, raged in meeting houses. And despite Coleman's efforts, we don't know if Violet was ever actually freed. Parsons died in 1783, and Coleman, in a move that still befuddles me, apologized to the congregation for sticking up for Violet and was allowed to rejoin the church. Complicated. These are complicated people. Violet was not mentioned in Parsons' will, but by the early 1780s in Massachusetts, legal slavery gradually came to an end as enslaved people successfully brought freedom suits and petitions to the courts. And just a really quick word about how Congregationalists today, the descendants of Abigail Cleveland and Mary Counts and Joshua Fletcher and Violet, participate in the commemoration of the American Revolution. At the Congregational Library, we are committing ourselves to making our collections accessible, providing educational opportunities, and seeking to inspire new research. We began a couple years ago by identifying primary sources from the period in our New England's Hidden Histories digital project and digitizing new material, which includes 100 new, previously unpublished manuscript sermons from the era of the Revolution. New England's Hidden Histories, which you can get to off our website, congregationallibrary.org, has 130,000 pages of scanned material from 1620 to 1850. And for those of you who aren't very comfortable with cursive handwriting, 26,000 pages are transcribed. For those of you who are comfortable and who want to volunteer to transcribe, talk to me afterwards. Next, we decided we would commemorate the 250th anniversary with creating an online exhibition. The stories of all the people I've talked about today, you can learn more about them in our Religion of Revolution exhibit. And then the chance opportunity to secure funding from the Massachusetts Office of Travel and Tourism allowed us to put on an in-person exhibit. So any of you who are in Boston this summer, come on over to 14 Beacon Street and we will show you our treasures. So in addition to these digital resources and exhibitions, we're hosting in-person and virtual programs and workshops to engage with various audiences, young and old, secular and religious. In this work, we engage thousands of online and in-person visitors with some of the fundamental questions that we all need to ask ourselves today. What role did religion or faith play in the American Revolution? How did the faith and worldview of Congregationalists animate them to throw off the only political system they had ever known? Did they achieve the freedoms for which they fought? And guess what? One of our in-person programs, which you can all find on YouTube when you go after this conference and look, is a performance of the songs from Abigail Cleveland's music book. Check it out to hear how Bunker Hill sounds in its full glory. I sincerely hope that Abigail Cleveland would approve of being remembered in this way. Thank you.
I'm Nancy Taylor, so those are the slides you need. Yes. Good morning, everyone. Again, my name is Nancy Taylor, and I am the Executive Director at the Presbyterian Historical Society in Philadelphia. Unfortunately, I will not have anything to say about music. Presbyterians were singers, but that is not part of my presentation today. I am honored to talk to you, though, about the American founding, using an object from the PHS collections as a jumping-off point. The object I have chosen is a block of wood. On the surface, I'm sure that makes no sense to you. What could this nondescript, relatively small object from the PHS collections possibly have to do with religion and the American founding? Plus, I'm sure it will appall some of you in the audience to know that when you turn over the block of wood, there's a label stuck to it. However, I can assure you that the donor of the object and my predecessors at PHS did think it was worth collecting and preserving. We actually have a number of wood fragments, nails, hinges, and other stray parts from historic churches and other Presbyterian structures. I like to think of these as disconnected fragments. I like to think of these disconnected fragments as the Presbyterian version of relics. This particular fragment is from Tusculum, pictured here in a 20th century lantern slide. Tusculum was built as the country house of Reverend John Witherspoon several years before the start of the Revolutionary War. The house near Princeton, New Jersey, still stands today, so I cannot tell you exactly how a chunk of wood beam ended up at PHS. My guess is that the beam was replaced during a long ago renovation. I bring Tusculum to your attention today as a way to consider the legacy of founding father John Witherspoon, the only active clergyman and college head to sign the Declaration of Independence. Unlike many of his fellow signers, Witherspoon was both Like many of his fellow signers, Witherspoon was both an influential leader and an owner of enslaved people. For centuries, however, his legacy did not account for his involvement with slavery. This block of wood allows me to advocate for wrestling with Witherspoon in all his dimensions and complexities, for it was at Tusculum that at least 2 enslaved people owned by Witherspoon worked and lived. This is the famous painting of John Witherspoon by Charles Wilson Peale, completed around 1783. Let me briefly share some background. John Witherspoon was born in Scotland in 1723, the oldest child of a pastor. He attended the University of Edinburgh and then served 2 parishes as a Church of Scotland minister in Scotland. He was 45 years old, a husband and a father, when 2 Americans, Benjamin Rush and Richard Stockton, who also became founding fathers, by the way, persuaded him to emigrate to America in 1768 to become the next president of the College of New Jersey, which is now known as Princeton University. This is the first known image of Nassau Hall at the College of New Jersey. It was completed a dozen years before Witherspoon's arrival, when Aaron Burr was college president. The school had been organized by Presbyterian pastors and chartered in the 1740s, and at the time it was built, Nassau Hall was the largest academic building in the American colonies. Thus, immigrating to head the College of New Jersey was not a bad gig for Witherspoon, especially given both his connections and the college's connections to prominent Americans of that era. By most accounts, Witherspoon was an excellent choice for the college. He built a reputation as a dynamic preacher, an engaged teacher, and a colonial leader, not just in Presbyterian, religious, and educational circles, but increasingly in politics as well. 250 years ago, 2 months before he began serving in the Continental Congress, in the Second Continental Congress, Witherspoon preached a sermon titled, "The Dominion of Providence Over the Passions of Men." Historian James Davis says this sermon became one of the most well-known and influential sermons of the Revolution. The quote I've highlighted for you on the slide captures for me the key takeaways. Witherspoon believed it necessary to justify speaking about politics from the pulpit, but he also made a strong case that God would side with the patriots because their cause was just. 1776 was just the beginning of Witherspoon's prominence. Over the next 15 years, he continued to lead as a Presbyterian, an educator, and an American patriot. He served in Congress until 1784. He signed the Articles of Confederation, and he supported ratification of the U.S. Constitution. He would head the College of New Jersey until his death in 1794. Thus, during 2 key decades in the history of the United States, a major inflection point between past and future, John Witherspoon influenced the course of American Presbyterianism and American history. I want to return to that block of wood from Tusculum. While it is not clear when John Witherspoon acquired the 2 enslaved persons listed in his estate at the time of his death, most historians believe it was tied to his need for labor at Tusculum when it became his primary residence in 1779. Witherspoon was not an anomaly in owning slaves. The College of New Jersey's first 9 presidents all owned enslaved people at some point in their lives. Unfortunately, little is known about the enslaved people at Tusculum. For example, I could not find their names. And historian James Davis says Witherspoon never wrote about them in any of his surviving correspondence. What we do have as evidence is what John Witherspoon did say and did not say in his surviving writings, what actions he did take and not take. In other words, with a wider perspective, we begin to understand the parameters that bounded Witherspoon's quote-unquote just cause. He did not believe, as some did, that enslavement was a benevolent practice supported by the Bible. He thought slavery would disappear in the United States within a generation. But he never called for abolition, and his political leadership kept people enslaved in New Jersey longer than any other northern state. While compatriots like Benjamin Rush and religious denominations like the Quakers argued openly for abolishing slavery, Witherspoon chose to side instead with slave interests in his own life, in Congress, at the college where he mingled with and taught enslavers, and in the Presbyterian Church. In 1787, the top governing body of the church came very close to passing a call for immediate abolition, but the final overture was amended and the body endorsed a gradual approach to ending slavery over an unspecified period of time. 2 years later, John Witherspoon convened and gave the opening sermon at the first General Assembly of the Presbyterian Church in the United States of America. And that assembly also chose to follow that same gradual emancipation course. Thus, while individual Presbyterians may have believed that enslavement was a sin and should be abolished in the new nation, Witherspoon's view of slavery prevailed at the denominational level, just as it did in the national government. And in New Jersey, Quakers and their allies had agitated for abolition throughout Witherspoon's tenure in America. It's not as if he never heard these arguments or interacted with people who were calling for abolition. In 1790, Witherspoon had an opportunity to directly influence state law in New Jersey when he served on a 3-man committee studying possible legislative action on slavery in that state. The committee recommended against full abolition. And New Jersey, again, was the last northern state to pass the gradual emancipation law in 1804. And in fact, slavery continued to exist on a small scale in the state until the passage of the 13th Amendment in 1865. Until recently, Presbyterians heaped honor and praise on John Witherspoon, lifting him up as lifting up his Revolutionary era renown as a preacher, educator, and politician. And don't get me wrong, he did excel at those things. For example, when the national headquarters of the Presbyterian Church USA moved into a new building in Louisville, Kentucky in the 1980s, it christened the street outside the building as Witherspoon Street. And closer to home, at the Presbyterian Historical Society, we have the responsibility of wrestling with Witherspoon and his legacy on a daily basis. The statue in the previous slide is one of 6 that stand before our building today. One of them is Witherspoon, and the picture from a more distant perspective, he is the person in the middle, and then in the one closer up, that statue is, again, the one in the middle. Today, we believe that PHS must tell a more nuanced history of these 6 white men at least half of whom were enslavers. It is not the easiest work. Sources can be hard to come by. And as we've seen recently, there are powerful forces in this country who are succeeding to a certain extent in returning us to a quote-unquote positive, one-sided view of history. That brings me back to where I started, with a piece of wood from Witherspoon's Tusculum estate. I'll share that there are actually 2 blocks of wood in the PHS collection from Tusculum, although I don't know much about the second one. It is doubtful that the donors of these wood blocks saw them as anything more than a representation of Witherspoon's renown. However, they prompt me to think about the 2 enslaved people who worked at Tusculum and how slavery cannot be separated from the history of the United States and of American Presbyterianism. I hope their existence may remind you to approach history critically as well, to ask hard questions, and to hold together things that we may think are easier or better to split apart. Thank you.
We really are going to do the brown bag annals now. So it actually works out great that I'm the last speaker on this panel because I'm going to talk more about the importance of archives themselves. So as we heard in the earlier panel and from everyone here today, history is incomplete. It is often told by the winners. It is often told by those who had the most power. It is important that religious archives continue to exist because we offer an alternative view of these events. We offer a more complete view. We often offer voices that are suppressed in the more traditional archives and the more traditional histories to give us a really complete view of history and what we're talking about here. So what's interesting is I am the first lay archivist for the Dominican Sisters of Peace. However, I am not the first archivist for the Dominican Sisters of Peace. All of the congregations had women who either had library science degrees or were actual archivists. Sometimes they were historians managing our collections. And what that means is that we have a huge amount of history that allows us to sort of fill in blanks for people as we are talking about seminal events in American history. So what's interesting about the Dominican Sisters of Peace is we actually arrived in this country right after the Revolutionary War. Our first congregation was founded in 1822 in St. Catherine, Kentucky, and then over the course of the next 100 years or so, different congregations were founded, and then in 2009 we became Dominican Sisters of Peace. DeRicci actually joined us in 2012, a few years later. But what's interesting about this is that all of these different congregations approached archives the same way. They recognized that they needed to be stewards of their own unique history. So let's step back a little bit. So Saint Dominic was the itinerant preacher. He walked across France and Spain spreading the gospel of Jesus. When we came to the United States, the first congregations were all women. And interestingly enough, our very first congregation that sort of had a house was women in Peru. So that sort of continued here into the United States. Our first foundings were all women. We do have Dominican men in the United States. They followed us a little bit later. So what we have here is women who were on the frontiers. St. Catherine's, Kentucky, I don't know if anybody knows where this is. It is very tiny. The Jim Beam distillery is there. That's the biggest thing there. It is still extremely isolated. It's very hard to get to any of these places. And we're talking about women who walked from Kentucky to Ohio to found our next congregation, St. Mary's of the Springs. So let's talk a little bit about some of our early history. So, the Sainsbury sisters, Mother Angela, who is on the right, my right, so the one who has the more white habit, and then the sister on the left is Mother Benvin. St. Catherine's was founded in 1822 by Angela. Somerset was founded in 1830 by Benvin. And the way this sort of happened is on February 28th, Father Samuel Wilson, who was pastor of St. Rose Parish near Springfield, Kentucky, preached what was undoubtedly one of the most important sermons of his life. He made a fervent appeal to the women of his parish to consider becoming members of the Dominican order. 9 young women answered that impassioned plea, and eventually 4 of them received habits of St. Dominic on April 7th, 1822. One of those sisters, Angela, is recognized as the founder of the first community of Dominican women in the United States, and they were the first community of active Dominican sisters in the world. Prior to this, our sisters were contemplative, so they stayed they were cloistered. So these were the first group of women who actually went out and worked with communities. Their first convent was a 1-room log cabin that was loaned to them by the Dominican friars. The first school was St. Magdalene Academy, and it was actually in an abandoned still house on the property that had originally been owned by the Sainsbury family, so it was brought as dowry. When sisters joined, they brought whatever they had with them, and it became property of the community. Just a few years later, on January 11th, 1830, Sister Benvin answered a call from Father Fenwick, who was the Bishop of Cincinnati, to open a school in Ohio. 4 sisters arrived in Somerset, Ohio on February 20th, 1830. It took that long because they walked from Kentucky to Somerset with 2 cows and all of their stuff on a wagon. So the thing I really wanted to talk about here is this tragedy that struck. In 1866, a fire raged through the St. Mary's Convent and School in Somerset. No lives were lost. Everybody was out teaching school. However, the entire archive was almost completely lost. Sister Benvin recognized the historical implications of the loss of the archives and raced to preserve her memories of the founding of the congregation. She wrote in pencil on the only paper in hand, a brown paper bag. And while we are unsure of exactly where and when Sister Benvin wrote the annals, we know that she felt the loss of the archives deeply. The archive only has a small number of materials from before the fire, mostly correspondence, and some pages from ledgers and from early profession books. Much of what we do have from those early years is in the form of annals and salvage materials. In 1904, a second fire destroyed the St. Catherine's Mother House in Kentucky, and again, almost all of the archives were lost. These losses represent more than our congregational history. Our sisters founded schools across Kentucky, Ohio, Michigan, Pennsylvania, New Orleans, and Kansas. I'm sure I'm missing some places. In most cases, the archive was the only place that we had the history of this founding of these schools. In many cases, these schools were the first schools to support deaf communities, to support special education, to support African American communities, to work with Native communities and indigenous populations, to work with them, not to preach at them. That is one of the things that St. Dominic really pushed, and the Dominican sisters follow today. We preach through action, not through words. So for them, it was all about demonstrating the life that you should live, and that life often involved service to others. So what we're actually here to talk about is Sister Benvin's annals. So as you can see here, they're very difficult to read. Pencil is great to erase things, and boy, does it not last long. And as you can see, they're on crumpled paper, and the words that you have on the screen here are some of the transcription of what we have here. The importance of these is that they represent the importance the sisters placed on their archives and on their history. They recognized that the history they were making at that time was going to be important later, and we needed to remember that. I like to say that when I started in 2022, I was ready to advocate for the archives. I had a sheaf of like documents that I was going to give to the leadership team. You know, here's what we need to support the archives. Here's why archives are important to history. And I walked in and they said, no, you don't need to do that. We're already on board. And then I walked into the Stags area and I'm greeted with organized boxes and folders and finding aids and all of this work. And I said, I'm the first professional archivist. And they said, we apologize for the state of the archives. And I said, if this is how you guys, do things badly, I'd love to see how you do things well. It was the most organized archive I've seen in my 20 years in the field. And that really says something about the Dominican sisters. They take record keeping seriously. The legacy of these annals has endured. So, to step back a little bit, annals are what the sisters write to sort of give us a history of what happened that year. House annals were always mandated by the mother generals, so every year somebody, and we don't know who it was, but a sister was tasked with writing out, here's what happened for the year. But what's interesting is that personal annals, like we saw with Sister Benman, were not a regular thing. Some sisters did them sporadically. Some of them were very diligent about it. Usually the archivists were the ones who wrote their annals every year. Everybody else we sort of had to fight with. What's interesting is that before the 1980s, we have a handful. In the 1980s, there was a call that went out across the Dominican order asking people to write down annals. So we got a bunch in the 1980s, and then they did a bunch of oral histories, and then it sort of dropped down to nothing. Poor Sister Nancy told me she managed to get 9 the year before I started. In 22, we got 36 annals. In 24, we got 76, and last year I got 83. And what we ended up doing is we started to do them together. Dominicans don't really do anything on their own. We have early stories, when a sister went somewhere, she always had to have another sister with her or a priest. Nobody does anything alone. So I said, let's do our annals together. So we started a workshop. During Archives History Month, which is October, everybody knows we're going to meet. We do a PowerPoint. I ask them about 9 different questions. We ask the question. Then I have my sister assistant give an example of what the answer should look like. What are we looking for here? And sort of give us an example. And then they write some stuff out, and then they turn them in at the end. It has been a wonderful thing. They look forward to it now. I get excited. People email me in September saying, are we getting those annals forms in? Yes. And what this means is that the work that the sisters continue to do will exist long past the sisters. So the median age of Dominican sisters in this country is 86 years old. And while we are amazingly fortunate that we still have young women who are in the process of becoming sisters, we just had 2 that took their final vows last year, which is remarkable considering the opportunities that women have nowadays. But what does that say to us? That the Dominican Sisters of Peace still have value in this world, that it is still a calling that women are having. And when the Dominican Sisters of Peace no longer exist, 50 years from now or 100 years from now, our archives will remain. It will ensure that historians like we have here today, that we have in the future, will be able to go back and say, okay, what was happening outside of that traditional archival view, the sort of the winner's view, that view that we get from the National Archives or from our state archives? What are we seeing from people on the ground? The stories that we've heard today, the stories that we're going to continue here today, come out of these religious archives, and they are so critical to the continued history of the continued development of American zeitgeist and American history. We are very fortunate in the Dominican Sisters of Peace to have some sources for us. We had sisters who were historians who wrote some really detailed books for us. So the information that I actually got for this came from 2 books. Signadu, which is the history of Kentucky Dominicans and sort of the development of the Dominican order in the United States, and A Place of Springs, which covers the history of the Dominicans in Ohio. And like I said, they were very influential. They founded dozens and dozens of schools everywhere. If it's a Dominican school, one of my sisters was probably in there. So thank you for your time today, and I really appreciate the opportunity to talk to you all.
I'd like to just take a brief moment and thank all of our wonderful panelists today on our panel, Religious Artifacts of the Founding. I think they've all done a wonderful job of showing us just how artifacts can nuance our understanding of history and how archives can be revolutionary even long after the fact where they were first compiled. So thank you for that. We're now going to take a 5-minute break. Okay, you've made it through part 1 of Religious Artifacts. Come back for a great part 2, and we'll see you in just a few minutes. Thank you. Okay, welcome back. It's good to have you guys here for what promises to be a scintillating part 2 to our religious artifacts, of the founding. As people are coming in and getting a seat, I believe I have the correct format of the program this time, so I think we'll have the correct order. I was looking at an outdated one last time. That was just to keep you on your toes, though, and you guys all did a wonderful job. Today, for our second panel on religious artifacts of the founding, we are pleased to welcome 3 wonderful distinguished guests. We've got Scott Meyer-Kukan, the CEO and president of E&R Library and Archives. We've got Sandy Bigtree, citizen of the Mohawk Nation and the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Reverend John Runkle, who is an Episcopal priest and a historical architect. Thank you, and join me in welcoming our distinguished panelists today.
Good morning. If it's still morning, I'm running on Eastern Standard Time, so I'm ready for lunch. But well, I'm here to talk about the German Reformed Church in the United States and the founding of America. Just a little bit about me before we begin. I've been involved with the E&R Library and Archives in some capacity since about 2014. I now currently serve as the president and CEO. My background, other than being a historian of the Evangelical and Reformed Church and the predecessor denominations, is both in archival and record management and nonprofit leadership. So a little bit about the E&R Library and Archives. We were officially first organized in 1863, although we do have evidence that our first system of archives was created in 1817. This makes us, as far as we know, the third oldest Protestant historical agency in the United States. We have 2 locations. Our central office and archives is in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, and a smaller branch location outside of St. Louis, Missouri. And our mission is to engage, inspire, and to educate people through the study and preservation of family and church history, putting to good use the records of the Evangelical and Reformed Church and its predecessor denominations, which we collect, preserve, and make accessible to the public. And you can learn more on our website there. Just a very quick overview of the Evangelical and Reformed Church, because it's not a name that you continue to hear today, and is a denomination that had the word "and" in it. That signifies that there was some type of combination or merger. So we begin with the German Reformed Church in the United States being organized in 1725 in Pennsylvania. Subsequently, there was a German Evangelical Synod of North America that was established in 1840 in Missouri. Those are the 2 bodies that came together in June of 1934 to create the Evangelical and Reformed Church. There was also a Hungarian Reformed Church that was organized in 1890. They came in to the Reformed Church in the United States in 1921 through what was known as the Tiffin Agreement. The Evangelical and Reformed Church really kind of seized under that name in June of 1957 when this denomination moved with the Congregational Christian churches, as Dr. Roberts talked about earlier today, to form what is today known as the United Church of Christ. I'm going to talk a little bit about one of our churches, Evangelical Reformed Church in Frederick, Maryland. But first, I don't want you to get confused with hearing the word evangelical here. This is not evangelical in the sense of the German Evangelical Synod that was organized in 1840. This church was organized on the Reformed Church side. We don't know approximately when it was organized, but we do know that its official records begin in 1747. We estimate sometime around 1740. But the word evangelical here simply means Protestant Reformed. It was discovered by Michael Schlatter, who was a prominent Reformed clergyman who helped other churches organize and expand in May of 1747. At that time, he assisted by preaching sermons and leading the sacrament of the Lord's Supper. The church was served by many intermittent clergymen, but the official and installed first pastor was a Reverend Theodore Frankenfeld. The picture that you see here on this slide is a historical image of the original building that is still located in Frederick, Maryland. I'd like to talk a little bit about Reverend Friedrich Ludwig Hennep. He was the first pastor to serve Evangelical Reformed Church for more than 5 years. Most pastors had only served for a year or two prior to him, but he served first between 1770 and 1784. He was born on October 7th, 1740 in Kaiserslautern, which is located in southwest Germany at the north end of the Palatinate Forest. He was the son of a minister, was educated at the Theological Seminary in Heidelberg, and arrived in Pennsylvania in 1725, where he first settled. He began his ministry at the Evangelical Reformed Church in Frederick, Maryland on October 8, 1769. And during his tenure, he baptized a total of 810 individuals and confirmed 1,526. He resigned in October 1784 to accept a call at a church in Reading, Pennsylvania, but he quickly became sick and died before he could move. Interestingly, his remains were buried in a grave that was walled up with brick under the altar of the church at this time. However, they decided to replace that church, and so his remains were removed to make room for what is now known as Trinity Chapel. His ashes were gathered up on June 14th, 1881, were held in the church, and then he was reinterred on July 2nd, 1881, in a nice grave at the rear of Trinity Chapel. Pictured here is just a snapshot of his baptism in Germany. So Reverend Hennep was serving Evangelical Reformed Church during the Revolutionary War. We don't know for certain if he did fight in battle, but we do know he was very supportive of the soldiers. Reports indicated that Pastor Hennep held services for the Hessian prisoners that were incarcerated at what is now known as the Frederick Barracks. At that time, they were the Hessian Barracks in Frederick. And there is one quote here where when he learned that General Cornwallis had surrendered, he just gave thanks to God for the peace that the war had ended. And this is a picture of Trinity Chapel here, where Reverend Hennep's remains are interred. So Evangelical Reformed Church and the Revolutionary War. So at this time, all men between the ages of 16 and 50 were required to enlist. So it's highly probable that the list of male members in this church in 1775 played some role in the Revolutionary War in Frederick, Maryland. That list comes to us from a book that was written, A History of Evangelical Reformed Church Unto Us. And we can kind of use that as a roster of the Revolutionary soldiers from this church. Older men, ages 51 and older, often were associators or were on committees of safety or committees of observation. Some of the youths who were 15 and younger might have become boy guards at the Hessian barracks. For the British prisoners, or worked in the poorhouse. All of this is evidence that in some way, while not everyone was in the battle zone in Frederick, Maryland, this church was really at the center of what was happening during the war in that area. And in some families, it is documented that 3 generations of men were involved in the war in some way or another. So this list that was taken from this history book of the Evangelical Reformed Church was also compared to the National Society of Daughters of the American Revolution, their list, and A History of Western Maryland by Thomas Sharp from 1882, and they've cross-referenced those names. Pictured here is a Revolutionary War pension and bounty land warrant application, and it's for a gentleman named Valentine Bruner of Frederick, Maryland, and we'll talk about his family in just a moment. I'd like to kind of pause for that just for a moment and talk a little bit about Francis Scott Key. While he's not considered to be part of the American Revolution per se. An interesting and connected tidbit of information to Reverend Friedrich Hennop is that he was baptized by Reverend Hennop in 1779. And interestingly enough, he would go on later to write the poem Defiance of Fort McHenry, which later would become our national anthem, the Star-Spangled Banner, in 1814. So the Bruner family, they first arrived in the Americas in 1728, and that was the son of Joseph Bruner, who came in 1729. He came on the ship Allen from Klein, meaning small, Schifferstadt, in the Rhineland-Palatinate part of Germany. Joseph married his wife, Katharina Elisabetha Thomas, in 1783, and together they had 8 children. His firstborn son, Johann Jakob, who I had just talked about a moment ago, came in 1728, a year later. But the interesting part about this family is the Daughters of the American Revolution Patriot Index lists a total of 19 Bruners at this time. And we have been able to trace 12 of those 19 all back to this Joseph and Catherine Bruner that came into Frederick, Maryland from Klein-Schifferstadt. Pictured here is Schifferstadt, which is the oldest standing house built of stone in Frederick, Maryland. It was built sometime between 1756 and 1758. And it's one of the nation's finest examples of German, Georgian colonial architecture. Joseph Bruner first purchased the 303-acre tract of land on which this house sits. And at the time of his death in 1753, the property was conveyed to his youngest son, Elias, who built the 30-foot by 40-foot stone house. In 1974, the Frederick County Landmarks Commission purchased this home. It's now open to the public as the Schifferstadt Architectural Museum and was designated a National Historic Landmark in 2016. So this small snippet just shares a little brief history of the German Reformed Church and how Evangelical Reformed Church in Frederick, Maryland was involved in the Revolutionary War activities at this time. I appreciate you taking the time to come out today, listening to this presentation. If you'd like to learn more about our organization and other Reformed churches that would have been involved in the Revolutionary War, our contact information is up there. You can certainly follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube at erlibrary.archives. So thank you.
Yes, hello again. I'm Sandy Bigtree. Hello, Phil Arnold. My husband's watching, so he couldn't be here too. Okay, we'll move on to artifacts of the founding. I had shown you a coin earlier that was minted by the U.S. Mint in January. It was very problematic around for the Haudenosaunee, but there was a coin also minted in 1988. So that is going to be a little more interesting. I'll give you a little background to that. In 1988, the House Resolution of 331, the concurrent resolution, acknowledged the contributions of the Iroquois Confederacy of Nations to the development of the United States. This was during the Reagan administration. I'm not sure he was aware of that, but you know, it was quite a landslide to see this acknowledgement by a minted coin of the United States. So they acknowledged all the contributions of American democracy going back to the Haudenosaunee. This is a picture of the coin. Note the arrows. I will be talking a little bit about these arrows, but that comes from our peacemaker who came to our lands to establish peace maybe 2,000 or so years ago. And that's very much a part of that narrative, the binding of these arrows. And they were incorporated into the presidential seal in the clutch of the eagle. The eagle sits atop our great binding piece. We have an image, it's white pine tree, and it has an eagle on the top that's always looking for any warning, any danger impending, so they can warn the Confederacy of how to address it before it turns into blown conflict, right? So whenever you look at the presidential seal, just know that clutch of arrows takes you back to this contribution the Haudenosaunee had. The next slide, it's such a complex history, and I'm listing all these books that are available to read that can go into much more in-depth explaining this. Exiled in the Land of the Free, The Forgotten Founders, Basic Call to Consciousness, Native Roots, How the Indians Enriched America, and Indian Roots of American Democracy. This last book, The Dawn of Everything, A New History of Humanity, you can read about the Wyandot speakers in Europe influencing the Enlightenment thinkers of that time. This is the late 17th century. We also have websites, indigenousvalues.org, where you can read more about this information. My husband's book that just came out recently is also mentioned on that website. We didn't include it up here for some reason. It's open access, so it's free. I mean, the message is much more important than making a lot of money, so it's been made free for your accessibility. We also have another website, doctrineofdiscovery.org. And that's going really, that's a whole new topic. Maybe you have not heard of this one. But we had a conference a couple years ago, and it was funded by the Luce Foundation, and we came out with just an extraordinary publication just last week. And that too is available on free, or it's available free, so go on that site to access that as well. I'm showing a book that came out. This is the first published book by the British, written by Cadwallader Colden. He goes through explaining how elegant speakers the Haudenosaunee were. This is oral tradition. He said they could move any audience, the brevity of language that was used. They were so powerful and just amazing. This little quote's by Lawrence Hoffman. We go on to Benjamin Franklin. He was very moved with the Haudenosaunee, in constant conversation, as was Franklin. This book by, let me see. Okay, so Franklin wrote this book about the Haudenosaunee and published in his pamphlets a lot of information on the Haudenosaunee. It'd be a very strange thing if 6 nations of ignorant savages, pardon that reference, should be capable of forming a scheme for such a union and be able to execute it in such a manner as that it has subsisted for ages and appears indissoluble, and yet that a like union should be impractical for 10 or a dozen English colonies to whom it's more necessary. Well, you can read on. At the time, our Loyani, one in particular, Canasategos, traveled to Independence Hall and convened with all these founding fathers. He spoke of the peacemaker and those bundle of arrows. And one of the references, you take one arrow and you can snap it. But if you take the 5 arrows of our Confederacy and you bind them with the sinew of a deer, it's protected, it's held in solidarity, and you cannot, break this unit. And that's where they got the reference to those clutch of arrows in the eagle's claw. As I said, this was, that pretty much goes through where Ganasatego was encouraging this union would fortify the Federation of the United States. They took that directly from the Haudenosaunee. So we have this solidarity of peacemaking. The Haudenosaunee, the word translates to people building a longhouse in English, of course. And what that means is that the longhouse, the ceiling of the longhouse is the sky, the floor of the longhouse is the earth, the door to the east welcomes the rising sun, and the door to the west welcomes the setting sun. So it's this whole integration with life and vitality of the natural world that sustains us. Okay, so this is what people greet when they come here from Europe. Let's enter now to Columbus. I don't know how many are aware that he sailed on the dictates of what's called the doctrines of Christian discovery. And these are a line of papal bulls that were written in the 15th and 16th century. The first one that was written was in 1452, Dum Diversus, and it pertained to Africa, and it was written by Pope Nicholas, authorizing Alfonso V of Portugal. And this is an excerpt taken from the decree. You are to invade, capture, vanquish, and subdue all Saracens and pagans, to reduce their persons to perpetual slavery, and to take away all their possessions and property. After Columbus landed on the Americas, he wrote a report to the Borgia Pope. The Borgia family were notorious merchants at the time. Pope Alexander VI wrote the next papal bull that pertained to America after he heard there was gold in these lands. And it was within weeks of Columbus's correspondence to the Pope. So this Borgia Pope calls for barbarous nations to be subjugated and brought to the Catholic faith and Christian religion for the propagation of the Christian empire. So this is for the establishment of Christendom. The vision was to encircle the globe. That seems like, pretty ancient documents. What does that have to do with today? Well, England wasn't going to sit back and let the Pope reap all the profits from what was going to be coming out of America. So through the Cabot Charter of 1496, King Henry VII of England granted North America to the Cabot family. And they used more of this language, quote, seek out, discover, and find whatsoever isles, countries, and regions of the heathens and infidels that before this time have been unknown to all Christian people. That's what Columbus returned with. By 1823, this language was encoded into U.S. property law in the Supreme Court case of Johnson v. McIntosh of 1823. Court Chief Justice John Marshall appropriates this same language, and that's what we're operating under, is this mentality of conquest, Christian conquest. The U.S. federal law uses the same dehumanizing language where Christian people have rights to land inhabited by Native people. And through the Cabot Charter, it morphed into the Protestant Reformation. The Cabot Charter was pretty much the eve of the Protestant Reformation, so that all then applied to Protestants as well. We think, well, okay, maybe we've moved on from this. But in 2005, there was one of our Haudenosaunee nations, the Oneida Nation, filed a land claim against Sherrill of New York, and they lost. And so the very first citation in that opinion, which was written, by the way, by Ruth Bader Ginsburg, the most liberal judge on that, seated at that time, she wrote, under the doctrine of discovery, fee title to the lands occupied by Indians when the colonists arrived became vested in the sovereign. First, the discovering European nations, and later the original states and the United States. So this is something very active today. This is how the courts deal with native land rights that we come into. So it's something to pay attention to. I also want to say that when the Haudenosaunee were talking to the founding fathers, Joseph Smith was right in the heartland of the Haudenosaunee. those tablets were found in the Seneca Hills of Gomorrah, right? So he too was influenced, as were all the people involved in the burned over district. It was a very inspirational time, and there's a great effort to keep this silenced as well, as you can see, these documents. Okay, thank you.
As I was introduced as an Episcopal priest, I think it's important to explain that the Episcopal Church is the following regeneration of the Church of England. And I'm here to speak about the Anglican perspective at the onset of the American Revolution. And an important thing for everyone to realize about the Church of England and the ministers that are in the Church of England is to acknowledge the monarchy as the defender of the faith, and that the monarchy is always included in the prayers at worship for the Church of England, which became a touchy point with the American colonies. So keeping that in mind, I'll begin my presentation to you. Did I hit the wrong button? There we go. Listen, my children, and you shall hear of the midnight ride of Paul Revere. Some of you may remember these opening lines from the poem written by Henry Wadsworth Longfellow in 1860. The poem became very popular in its day and made a national hero out of Paul Revere, even though Longfellow took some liberties with the facts of the historic event. Still, the poet continues. He said to his friend, "If the British march by land or sea from the town tonight, hang a lantern aloft in the belfry arch of the North Church Tower as a signal light. Oneth by land and twoeth by sea, and I on the opposite shore will be, ready to ride and spread the alarm through every Middlesex village and farm, for the country folk to be up and to arm." And I share Longfellow's poem because it brought a tremendous amount of attention to the historic artifact I present today and the extraordinary events of April 18, 1775. The artifact is the tower of Old North Church in Boston, an Anglican church at that time representing the Church of England and King George III in the colony of the province of Massachusetts Bay. And the event is known as Paul Revere's Ride. And as you can see in the painting on the screen before you, between the horse and the corner of the house where the gentleman's reaching out the open window, you can see in the distance a steeple, church steeple, that has two small dots of light painted on it, representing the Old North Church Tower. And the Old North Church Tower at the time, as you can see in this rendering of what its appearance was like. To understand the artifact and the event better, it's helpful to know the context in which it took place. That's because the size and layout of Boston was very different in 1775 than what we know today. And I have a map that shows an overlay of Boston in 1775, and then you can see beneath that the outline of Boston as it is today. So that in 1775, Boston was almost an island in and of itself, with the land arm that is extending out to the lower left corner to the mainland. And since then, Boston, of course, has been infilled quite a bit, so it's almost grown together. But you can see on this map the location of the Old North Church on that peninsula in the upper right part of the city, as well as where the Boston Massacre took place in the midst of Boston, and then even further down the location of where the Boston Tea Party took place. So I wanted you to see how Boston was much smaller and much more surrounded by water at that point in time than what we understand it today. And this second map shows the same overlay of how Boston was in the 18th century and where this poem and the act of the signals from Old North Church were being directed toward Charlestown, which is just up above the north arm of that peninsula in Boston proper. Old North Church was and is a prominent building on the northern end of the old city skyline. And this is a photo showing the north side of Boston at this point in time, and you can see the steeple of the church as it extends well above even the existing buildings that are there today. It presented the means by which the patriots could send an inconspicuous signal to their fellow patriots on the other side of Boston Harbor, alerting them that the British Army intended to send troops into Charlestown and Middlesex County to seize military supplies stockpiled by the colonists there. There were approximately 6,000 British troops in Boston at the time, and they planned to send 700 to 800 soldiers on this expedition. A photo at night, obviously in the present day, but yet illustrating the two signal lights that were in the steeple to alert the patriots on the other side of Boston Harbor. According to Old North Church's website, on the night of April 18th, 1775, the church's sexton, Robert Newman, and a vestryman, Captain John Pulling Jr., broke Boston's military curfew and secretly climbed Old North steeple to display the two lanterns. The lanterns were coded signal devised by Paul Revere that British troops were traveling across the Charles River. So they were coming by sea and not by land. And if you remember that first map that I showed, it would have been a long and difficult to travel for the Army to reach Middlesex County by using that path. So sea made the most efficient use of and the quickest way for the British Army to reach the other shore. The signal launched a network of riders who spread the message wide and far. And the next morning, the first shots of war broke out with the battles of Lexington and Concord. And Old North had lit the way for the American Revolution to take place. Now, admittedly, in 1775, American loyalists in Boston significantly outnumbered Anglican patriots, so that the idea that the Old North Church congregation strongly supported the colonial cause is not entirely true. Anglicans in the colony of Massachusetts were widely perceived as loyal to the British Crown. Not only that, but the overwhelming majority of the Boston population was Congregationalist, not Anglicans. And the Anglican presence was relatively small compared to the Puritan Congregationalist majority in the entire colony. Still, Old North Church was an Anglican church, the King's Church, and yet it was used to subvert the king's power and rule. A seditious act, to be sure, suggesting that the Anglican patriots did not buy into the notion that King George III was the true, authentic defender of the faith. A defender of the faith at the time, the English monarchs have held this title since King Henry VIII. Second, the signal transformed Old North's steeple into a symbol of freedom, even though it was funded in part by proceeds of enslaved labor, such as the wood donated for the steeple's construction came from a British company operating in the area of present-day Belize that relied on enslaved black and indigenous people to harvest the material. So the steeple, like the nation itself, and as we've repeated a few times the past 2 days, it has a complex history to teach us about the American Revolution and the various forces at work at the time. Thank you.
I'd like to quickly thank all three of our panelists for their discussion today on artifacts of the Revolution. And we have about 7 to 8 minutes for questions. So if anyone has a question, feel free to raise your hand. Tell us the question. I will try to repeat it for our panelists, and then we'll let you guys answer. Any questions?
How did the Anglican Church sort of divest itself from the defender of the faith while still remaining true to the principles?
How did they navigate these loyalties on the eve of revolution?
How did they navigate the loyalties?
Loyalties. Well, sorry. This is about the Anglicans.
Oh,
Anglican Church. Sorry.
Okay.
Well, it was a point of separation because there were examples of the Book of Common Prayer, which is the book that Anglicans use to guide their worship. Up until the Revolution, included prayers for the monarch, for the health and the well-being of the monarch. And there were Anglican parishes that refused to do that and scratched out the monarch and replaced the Continental Congress as that. So once the break happened between the British Empire and the colonies, then the church legally no longer existed as the Church of England. And it evolved into, in 1786, the formation of the Episcopal Church. In the majority of its form, but we no longer acknowledged the primacy of the monarch. Now that caused a problem administratively with the Episcopal Church, because the Episcopal Church looks to bishops as leaders of our tradition, and the way that our bishops have apostolic connections to the bishops that preceded them. Presumably they went back to the apostles. And so in order to be a bishop, you had to assign allegiance to the monarch. And since we've been separated from the church, if a prospective bishop went to England to be ordained by an existing bishop, they wouldn't do it because we wouldn't swear allegiance to the monarch. And ultimately what happened is prospective bishops went to Scotland, who had their connection, their apostolic connection with previous bishops. And they ordained the first bishop in the American church. And then ultimately, after some period of time, the British acknowledged that they would ordain bishops. But the Episcopal Church formally looks to Scotland as the means by which the apostolic succession was extended to the bishops in this country.
Question for Scott. So one of the sad things we know about 20th century U.S. history is that German immigrant communities and German religious communities often get targeted and persecuted in times of war. Is there any evidence that like Hessian soldiers who are coming over and fighting are in the communities where the German Reformed are as well, and that's increasing any sort of persecution, or if there's any sort of common cause that people are associating with them?
So Hessian soldiers, right? These are soldiers that have been hired by the King of Britain. They are German and coming over and fighting for the crown. What was the interaction like?
Yeah, as I was talking about Reverend Hennop, he was very supportive of the Hessian soldiers. And so I think we can draw the conclusion from that evidence that there was a large sense of sympathy and support while possibly using a religious way to go about it and to promote peace for all. Certainly, I think there was an allegiance that was unspoken at that time to the Hessian soldiers.
We have time for one more question, so make it good. No, it'll be great.
So I was recently at a conference where there was a newspaper archivist talking about all of their work and how they've been paying special attention to Revolutionary era newspapers. And he talked about how he found that the Old North Church lights were actually used often. One of the things that they also used to signal to the countryside was if they thought there was a slave rebellion brewing. And so, I don't know, maybe it's a comment, or how do you view that as like further complicating the...
Oh, you're talking to me?
Oh, no.
Oh, I didn't think so.
Well, I did not know that, but it certainly would complicate the continued history of what it represents. But with the idea that the steeple represents freedom, it could certainly be interpreted that that was in support of enslaved people's freedom. So
No, it was the opposite. It was
they were signaling
your slaves are plotting against you.
Right.
It was
Yeah.
not.
I'm sorry, I didn't know that. That's news. So anyway, thank you for sharing that.
Thank you for all of these wonderful questions. Just to conclude, I'll just add one thing really quick that came to my mind as you guys were talking. You know, when John Adams was reflecting on the Revolutionary War some decades later, he made recourse to artifacts too. He said trying to get the 13 colonies to operate together was like trying to get 13 clocks to chime at the same time. Now, I don't know about you, time just changed. I only had 3 clocks to deal with, and that was a chore, right? But what I think the panelists have done, especially in the last 2 panels, they've shown us that if we really want to understand the nuance and the complexity of the revolution, artifacts are a great way to do that. And also, as Sandy has pointed out, we need to go beyond the colonies themselves to look at the people that were here originally. So thank you all for your wonderful comments and helping us understand this complex period a bit better. Thank you. We'll meet back in here in about an hour at 1 o'clock to continue our discussion. Thanks.